What blocks the Christian possibility for modern people? At least two things. Bruce Charlton. One of the reasons that argument and persuasion, in general, are ineffective with modern people, is that their wrong ideas are based upon more than one false assumption. This means that if just one false assumption is challenged, and an argument can only do one thing at a time, the error remains, because held in place by the, currently unaddressed, false assumption. Modern man begins with a conviction that death is annihilation, that death of the body, including brain, and all brain activity, entails total destruction of that person. Thus, rejection of the desirability of eternal resurrected life by following Jesus Christ, is held in place by the modern person's materialism, his unbelief in even the possibility of life after death, unbelief in a spirit, or soul, that can exist without the body, and after the death of the body. To become a Christian, a person first needs to cease to be a materialist. But, when a modern person is persuaded that there is more than the material, the spirit is real, that there is a world of the spirit, then this is not sufficient to direct him towards becoming a Christian. Those who newly believe in a world of spirit are presented with, on the one hand, a Christianity that is manifest in the materialism of this world, including the bureaucratic institutional reality of the churches. And on the other hand, the newly spiritual individual is culturally offered a variety of pure spirit, oneness ideals, whereby the spirit is presented as a separate and superior realm of being, and the individual self, and our thinking, as this worldly incarnation caused delusions that need to be overcome in order to enter fully the realm of spirit. Repelled by the bureaucratic materialism of Christian churches, each of which presents itself as essential in order to achieve salvation after death, the newly spiritual person is told that he needs to leave behind his ego self, and our thinking. Therefore, the idea of bodily resurrection after death becomes regarded not so much as nonsense, as actively undesirable, a clinging to the delusion that is the body, and an egotistical refusal to give up the autonomous thinking agent. This is important, after, and this is a difficult transition, a modern person becomes convinced that there is a spiritual realm, that the spiritual is eternal and therefore superior to the corruption and death of this world, and that he will survive bodily death in a spirit form. Then he is inclined to regard the Christian offer of bodily resurrection as a childish thing, a kind of simplistic regression, a step backwards not forwards. The newly spiritual person is likely to regard with disdain, or dismay, the Christian ideal of remaining a separate being from God, both physically separated by having a body, and mentally separated by retaining selfhood and the capacity for independent thinking. While Christians regard love as existing between free individuals, the newly spiritual modern person is more likely to understand love as being universally directed at the entirety of reality, and a state of complete absorption into the divine, which is also everything. For the newly spiritual modern person, spirituality implies a giving up of individuality, and a return to an original state of undifferentiated oneness. So, instead of the self being annihilated at death by ceasing to exist, as mainstream modern people believe, the self is annihilated after death by giving up its selfhood and autonomy, and all capacity for thought, by assimilating into universality. My point is that the Christian finds himself at least, 2 removes from conversion of a mainstream modern materialist. 1 big step being to induce belief in the realm of spirit, but then there comes a whole other business of trying to explain what resurrection means, why Christians want it, what heaven is like, and why Christians desire to retain personal agency, the capacity for thought, and gain a new body after death. Oneness spirituality may also appear in the guise of a quest for wholeness or holism, under the assumption that anything less than everything is incomplete, and thereby insufficient. Christianity is about eternally loving relationships, and with each loving relationship unique, irreplaceable, not about attaining oneness/universality/wholeness/holism. An astrological case study. William Wildblood. Some 25 years ago I made a serious study of astrology and found, beyond any possible doubt, that it is a true science. I use that word, but in reality astrology is a mixture of science and art, which is why the materialistic scientist will always have a problem with it. A horoscope requires interpretation, which is not to say that anything goes, but astrology is a symbol system and symbols can work out in more than one way depending on the subject. However, anyone who seriously engages with astrology on the more than rudimentary sun sign level will find that it offers a genuine description of many aspects of reality. The branch I found most interesting was that which describes an individual's personality based on the position of the planets at his birth, otherwise known as psychological astrology. Thus you have the sun, moon and various planets in the solar system, all representing different aspects of human nature, and their position in the sky in the various constellations tells us what form those aspects will take. There is a lot more to it than that, and I won't go into detail here. I will just say that of the many birth charts I studied, not one was inaccurate as a map of the concerned individual's psyche, and many people expressed surprise that I had described them so well. This was not down to any skill of mine. I just said what I saw in the chart. Knowing my own birth chart has also given me greater insight into and understanding of my own character, and this, I think, is the most useful part of astrology. Know thyself is the old maxim. Astrology is one of the best ways to do just that. I never had much interest in predictive astrology. For one thing, I don't think the current state of astrological knowledge is far enough advanced to be very helpful in this regard, but, more importantly, I don't think God wishes us to know our future except, possibly, in the vaguest of terms. And I have no time for the fatalistic, superstitious side of astrology, but that is not the fault of astrology itself. It is ignorant, self-seeking human reaction to it. You may as well blame love for jealousy. Having said that, I certainly do think astrology can be used as a predictive method, and sometimes I have looked at the astrological significators after a particularly momentous event to see if the event could have been foreseen or, better put, was described in the planetary pattern. In my book Meeting the Masters, I related how the solar eclipse of 1999 coincided with a heart attack and subsequent death of a friend of mine whose Jupiter was right on the point of the eclipse. More recently I was involved, peripherally, in an incident which also brought out the profound interconnection between the signs in the heavens and events on Earth. A person I know was involved in a bad accident. He was cycling round a roundabout when a car drove straight into him and knocked him over. The driver, who was a woman in her 90s, surely, incidentally, such people should not be allowed to drive or, at the very least, have to take regular tests, was completely at fault. The right of way was his. She had been stationary, waiting for a car to go round the roundabout and presumably didn't see the cyclist directly behind that car and just drove right into him. The person's injuries were considerable. He had to be airlifted to hospital where it was found he had broken his ribs, collarbone, shoulder, femur and hip, and in addition his spinal column was severely damaged. He was placed in an induced coma for 48 hours, underwent several operations, one of which lasted for 9 hours, and his chances of ever walking again are slim. I happened to know this person's horoscope, having once done his chart. It occurred to me that something as life-changing and dramatic as this should be shown in the chart, so after it was clear that he was beginning to make some kind of recovery, it would not have seemed decent to do so before. I looked at the progressions and transits for that day to see what they indicated. If astrology had any kind of substance to it, they would surely have indicated something. Even with my limited knowledge, it seemed obvious that Mars should be involved. And it was, heavily involved. Before I describe exactly how, I should briefly go over just what progressions and transits are for the uninitiated. These are the two main methods of prognostication. Transits are simple. You just compare the current position of the planets with their positions in the natal chart. On your birthday every year the Sun makes a conjunction with where it was when you were born, as should be obvious since we have a solar calendar. But every planet will have some sort of angular relationship with all the other planets in the birth chart at any given time. The most important are conjunctions, same place, squares, 90-degree angle, oppositions, opposite or 180 degrees, and trines, 120 degrees. Some of these are harmonious and some challenging, but that also depends on the nature of the planets. It is also important to realize that the ways in which interactions may work out often depend on the person and how well or badly he or she is able to handle and channel the energies involved. This is one reason why the same thing will work out differently for different people. Every soul is unique and no two souls react in quite the same way to the same thing. That's transits. Progressions are slightly more technical but not complicated. The theory behind progressions is that the greater is contained in the lesser and cycles repeat themselves. Thus, in the most usual form employed, every day of your life starting from birth has the same basic pattern as the equivalent year. So one day after you are born contains the pattern for the first year of your life, the second day contains the patterns for the second year, the third day for the third year, and so on. To see what is going on in your 50th year, you would look at the chart for 50 days after you were born. Then you would compare that chart to the birth chart, or else to the transits for the time in question, what the planets are actually doing now, or else subjected to internal analysis to see how the planets are interacting between themselves in the progressed chart. It would have been quite time-consuming to draw all this up before the advent of computers, but now it is very simple, even if I believe all would-be astrologers should certainly know how to draw up a chart themselves by hand using an ephemeris. That will give them a better insight into the mechanics of the thing. That, at any rate, was my experience when I started. Another predictive technique is to use what are called solar returns. This is to cast the horoscope for that time when the Sun returns to its natal position, i.e. your birthday, and use that as a forecasting device for the ensuing year. I've never used this before, but when I applied it to the present case it did have something interesting to say. I looked at the progressions for the time of the accident, and the first thing I saw was that Mars was indeed very active. It formed an exact, less than 1 degree of difference, opposition to the progressed Sun. Standard interpretations of this would point to a time of anger, irritability and conflict on the one hand and, externally speaking, a tendency to suffer accidents and danger of injury on the other. What makes this worse is that both these planets are square, again to the degree, to progressed Jupiter, which would have the effect of blowing up and exaggerating any of these tendencies, Jupiter normally inflating what it touches. In this case, with the 90-degree angle, negatively. The precise placements are Sun at 25 degrees Aries, Mars at 24 degrees Libra, less than a degree off the Sun, and Jupiter at 25 degrees Cancer. This makes a very tight T-square, as it is known, which is regarded as one of the most challenging configurations in astrology. Now, one has to be careful. In terms of the progressed chart, which, let us recall, moves 1 day for each year, this very close configuration will have been in place for a couple of years and it has another year to run. It may have been even tighter a few months ago. But this just means that psychologically the subject may have felt an inner anger and frustration. I believe this was the case, though it wasn't expressed, and that may have been the problem. What is bottled up and suppressed, which is quite different to controlled, has a tendency to burst out and manifest externally. But why, if this configuration had been in operation for almost 2 years, did it express itself with such violence on the day it did? The answer again lies with Mars. I mentioned transits. On the day of the accident, Mars was at 24 degrees of Libra, making an exact conjunction with progressed Mars and therefore an exact opposition with the Sun and square to Jupiter. This triggered the whole thing, and you could not ask for a more dramatic demonstration of the truth behind astrology. Astrologer Robert Hand in his book Planets in Transit says of Mars conjunct Mars that any repressed aggressive energies, which will be running high at this time, will out either physically through an accident or by projection, that is, you will experience the energy through another. This means that you may have to endure another person's aggressive acts, which may bring you harm. Another work speaks of violent acts and tendency to suffer injuries. The point could not be more clear. This is just what one would have expected to see. Astrology is not always so precise, but here it reveals itself plainly. Earlier I spoke of the solar return, that being the chart cast for the ensuing year on one's birthday. When I looked at this, what jumped out was an exact, to the degree again, conjunction between the Sun and Saturn and, with less than 2 degrees of separation, another between the Moon and Pluto. This speaks without the slightest ambiguity of hardship and trial in the year ahead, with deep emotional upheaval and upset involved. It could not be more plainly stated that there will be suffering in the year to come. Possibly some readers will not be interested in the subject of this post. Some may even disapprove of it. But if the heavens declare the glory of the Lord, they also show his wisdom. Astrology is not a substitute for religion or spiritual understanding, but it can be a very helpful adjunct to it. The signs displayed in creation are ways to help us engage with it, and understand it on a deeper level. At the very least, they can show us that there is pattern and purpose. In this case, the person involved is not a believer in astrology. Indeed, he specifically rejects it as superstitious nonsense, and from a scientific rather than religious point of view. However, it is possible that if, somewhere down the line when he has come to terms with what has happened to him, he engaged with it, then it might help him see his new situation in a slightly different light, and be able to find a positive aspect to an otherwise wholly negative experience. I hope so, while recognizing the enormous challenge anyone in this position would face. May God bless him and help him recover from his traumatic experience both physically and emotionally. The only point about other people's false assumptions is what they can teach us about our own. Francis Berger.
To reflect upon the delusions of civilization cannot, of course, serve any other useful purpose than to help us detect our own delusions, which we acquired unawares in school and from books, magazines, television, or while necking at the movies. There is nothing any of us could possibly do about the chaotic mental condition of mankind, so the only point about other people's false assumptions is what they can teach us about our own.
This excerpt from Stephen Wiesent says the rules of chaos provides a pointed reminder about discerning false assumptions, delusions, and general stupidity in others. If such discernment does little more than make us feel good about our own intelligence, then we have not penetrated deeply enough into the genuine point of recognizing false assumptions. I'm not sure about this being the only point, but it is a big one. We often interpret our discernment of false assumptions and stupidity in others as confirmation of our own sagacity and wisdom, when we ought to use such moments of clarity, understanding, and acuity to determine what they might contribute to revealing about our own lingering false assumptions, delusions, and stupidity, and then learning from this and taking responsibility for this learning.
Indeed, the ability to learn from the follies of others to recognize one's own is another vital element of intelligence. Without this ability, one cannot hope to become as bright as one's capacities would otherwise allow. The difficulty is that most of us tend to assume that seeing through someone else's stupidity is proof of our own wisdom.
Wiesent was an avowed atheist that could no longer bring himself to follow the hypocrisy of organized religion variety. Rather than explore the possibility of believing in God beyond the context of churches and organized religion, Wiesent chose the well-trodden path of the mid to late 20th century freethinking artist/intellectual. His motivations for doing so are likely complex, but I suppose they come down to simply going with the 20th century flow of secularization and despiritualization in the West. Wiesent offers some interesting points and insights, and I consider him an intelligent, albeit limited, writer. His motivations are often blurred, yet I believe he was essentially writing and thinking from a good place, or at least as good a place he could occupy given his materialism. Having said that, I firmly believe that his metaphysical assumptions are false. The trick now is avoiding feelings of superiority and figuring out what this discernment may reveal about my metaphysical assumptions. Lately, I have been doing the same with nearly all the 19th and 20th century writers and thinkers I have read or encountered, to say nothing of the endless parade of civilizational delusions we have all endured since 2020. Erecting a middle realm between the private subjective and public objective is a dead end. Bruce Charlton. Through the 20th century, but especially since the late 1960s, and associated with hippie/New Age spirituality, there have been many repeated attempts to erect a middle realm to mediate between the private and subjective realms, and the public and objective realm. In other words, for many people the spiritual problem of modernity is alienation, the severing between subjective and objective, and the consequent denigration of the subjective, so that modern people experience life as a personally purposeless and meaningless, temporary and brief, state of mere existence in an indifferent universe, which is operating on the basis of randomness and mechanical causality. In the pre-modern era, this situation was, to varying degrees, ameliorated by the Church, which provided a shared, public, sacred realm of ritual and symbolism. This meant that the individual had an indirect, because mediated, relationship with divine reality, yet the symbolism and ritual was, although intermittent, so effective in bridging the gap, as to enable engagement, participation, between man and reality, making life broadly tolerable, and sometimes spiritually fulfilling. Due, I believe, ultimately to change in man's consciousness, the symbolism and ritual lost its connecting power, and left modern man bereft and alienated. The new and traditional middle realm systems were, implicitly, an attempt to replace what the churches had once provided. There have been, and are, many middle realm systems. One, and the most explicit, was provided by C.G. Jung and various neo-Jungians such as Joseph Campbell and James Hillman. Such people envisaged an underlying, mostly unconscious, collective objective psyche, shared by all men in all times and places. The idea was that modern, subjective man could engage with this middle realm of the psyche as a kind of symbolic/ritual bridge, accessed via meditation, dream, psychotherapy, personal creativity, arts, crafts, etc. Such Jungian ideas provided a rationale for a massive resurgence in occult traditions and new systems of symbol and ritual, which had the advantage over traditional churches of novelty and abundance. Novelty and abundance together overcome habituation and fatigue, so that a whole life could be spent in exploring, sampling, and permutating spiritual systems selected from the New Age smorgasbord. So, there have been big revivals of astrology, tarot, alchemy, numerology, Neoplatonism and the like, and new systems based on UFOs, crop circles, geomancy, earth energies, cosmic radiations, and a multitude of healing therapies with spiritual implications. I'm afraid I regard all such attempts as essentially misguided because regressive, hence ineffective. And indeed, despite great hopes for a new age-inspired global spiritual revival, the world has become more and more materialistic, bureaucratic, and totalitarian. Spirituality, as well as religion, has been eliminated from the public realm in the West. Or, at the least, reduced to reactive, insincere, and ineffectual rhetoric, such as the regular call from and to explicit atheists to pray for such and such victims. Politics now, very obviously, drives religion, and spirituality merely fits around prior left ideologies such as anti-racism, carbon environmentalism, socialism, feminism, healthism, etc. Middle realm construction and advocacy is misguided, ineffectual and a dead end. What actually happens with such middle realm constructions, is that they become absorbed into materialism. Instead of making a bridge connecting modern man from the material to the spiritual, these systems either do nothing but provide lifestyle options. Or else the rituals and symbols crystallize into the material to become large, difficult and complex systems, the preserve of experts and professionals, standing between the individual and the spiritual in much the same way as institutional churches. This is why I am filled with a mixture of boredom and dismay whenever I come across one of these middle realm systems, describing some large/difficult to understand/complex layer of ideas, or purporting to give information or teaching concerning the higher or spiritual world, which spiritual world always seems to resemble a complex, hierarchical, multi-specialized, multinational corporation, or bloated state bureaucracy. These middle realms purport to be bridges and mediations, but I see just another barrier. After many centuries during which the effectiveness of mediation has progressively dwindled, and all churches and religions have become corrupted to the agenda of this worldly, materialist leftist, socio-politics, we are now confronted by a situation in which our choice is either to abandon the subjective along with the spiritual, and accept our status as depersonalized units in a transhumanist world. Or else, to approach reality, including God, directly and, as much as possible, unmediated. Are litmus test traps difficult to avoid? Not really, not so far. Bruce Charlton. It has been noticed in this corner of the blogosphere, that the litmus test issue of the current Arrakis war has flipped some people, both Christian and based, to the establishment side. The observation is that a significant number of individuals who had seen through the Birdemic, anti-racism, climate energy etc. and stayed on the right side of the spiritual war, have fallen for the aggressively pro-Choam Western establishment line, with anyone who fails to toe this line branded racist. These people have, in effect, changed sides in the spiritual war, at least on this major issue, and, unless they repent, we can expect them to converge increasingly from now onwards. Less remarked is that those who have taken the side of the freemen in the Arrakis conflict are doing exactly the same thing, but less obviously. Because, on this issue, the mainstream media and political institutions are, in fact, divided between a pro-Choam majority and a pro-freeman minority, but both are included within the mainstream narrative, both have significant establishment support, both are part of the narrative. This may sound fiendishly clever, implying that it is therefore difficult, impossible, for anyone to navigate such litmus tests, where, apparently, people are caught by whatever their choice. But really this isn't difficult. The rule is that anything which features strongly in the mainstream media, and major point of view, whether presented as pro or contra, is significantly and decisively wrong. The very fact of major and sustained media coverage shows this. Whenever the mass media makes a big story, and whenever that story is presented as having two sides, we can be sure that we are being played and the side of real good is not being mentioned. Both presented choices of mainstream sides are surely wrong, because establishment endorsed. As I say, this isn't difficult, so far, although it may be more difficult to learn where the concealed, unmentioned good choice actually lies, if there is one. If there is one. Because with some major mainstream issues, there is no good position that can be adopted, the whole issue is rotten. When both sides are wrong, the whole issue is tainted. The Freeman War is an example of this. It represents a black hole for true values. It insatiably sucks up attention, learning, evaluation, opinions, and triggers participants to engage in prognostication and policy mongering. Another example is electoral politics, the entire discourse of parties. Leaders and elections is itself a corruption, and participation is itself a choice of taking the wrong side. Whatever it is that the evil liars of the establishment want us to attend to and discuss, we know that must be wrong, and the rule applies to supposed minority and unpopular attitudes and ideologies, for example pro-Freeman, pro-Trump, sensible environmentalism, free speech, meritocracy, as much as to the mass and leadership endorsed opinions. metaphysical assumptions must be assumed. Berger. Metaphysical assumptions are beliefs about the fundamental nature of reality. Metaphysics deals with ideas, doctrines, or an asserted reality that lies beyond the sense perception of humans. As such, metaphysical assumptions cannot be proven through the objective or empirical study of material reality. Instead, they rely on the acceptance of ideas and beliefs as true, albeit without proof. Empirical science has yet to succeed in proving the existence of the spiritual. At the same time, empirical science cannot disprove the spiritual. Hence, belief in the spiritual exists in the realm of assumptions, in things that are accepted as true without being proven as such at the material level of the senses. The metaphysics part is the hope that these unproven beliefs are not merely fantastic notions or pipe dreams but reach all the way down to the fundamental nature of reality, thereby explaining or fleshing out aspects of reality that extend beyond the reaches and capacities of empirical study. An empirical study of the universe can formulate the idea of the Big Bang, but it offers little to explain the overarching purpose or meaning of the Big Bang. In light of this, all serious metaphysical assumptions require assumption, that is, all individuals holding such assumptions must take them on and shoulder personal responsibility for them. Metaphysical assumptions cannot be assumed in a take-for-granted sense, they must be assumed in a taken-on sense, assuming responsibility, complete with the willingness to regard them as a personal duty by which one structures, approaches, and lives life. To know our metaphysical assumptions is to live by them, and to live by our metaphysical assumptions is to know them. Such assumptions require choice, and choice relies on motivation. An honest appraisal of the motivations behind one's choices is the first step toward knowing the truth of one's metaphysical assumptions. Claiming that one has no choice in such matters or that motivation is of little consequence in metaphysics should be taken as signs that inevitably point to the presence of seriously flawed or false metaphysical assumptions, regardless of the supposed authority from which such assumptions arise. JRR Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and wanting heaven, rather than death or continued this life. Charlton. Since the Christian churches are thoroughly corrupted and converged to totalitarianism, and Christian evangelism has proved all but useless in the modern West, our best hope perhaps lies in inculcating a desire for heaven that may influence our postmortal choices. In other words, since it seems modern people place this worldly socio-political issues above religion and spirituality, which are assumed to be a mixture of wishful thinking and institutional manipulations. And since this civilization has adopted a materialist set of metaphysical assumptions that renders life beyond death impossible, modern man expects or wants only a painless death followed by annihilation, or maybe hopes for some kind of transhumanist scientific extension of this life. Against this, there may be a few countervailing influences, such as J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis's fantasies, which encourage, perhaps implant, at least a desire for something more, something beyond death, a daydream and yearning for heaven in particular, however vague this notion in the mind of modern man. This daydream/desire/yearning may be the best or only hope that post-mortal men will at least consider accepting the gift of Jesus Christ. Such is the importance of Christian fantasy in this age. Beware of daily bread buttered on both sides. Berger. The daily bread in the Lord's Prayer in Matthew and Luke petitions God to provide us with the means necessary for our sustenance on a day-to-day basis. The appeal refers to food specifically but likely implies everything required to sustain us in life. The daily aspect reflects the trust and faith in God's ability and motivation to provide each individual with what they need each and every day. Since man cannot live by bread alone, God's provisions also include things required to sustain us spiritually and help us prepare for life everlasting, once again, on a daily basis. At the most fundamental level, the appeal for daily bread is an appeal for God to grant us the things that not only sustain us but also benefit us day to day, particularly from a spiritual perspective. The Lord's Prayer makes no mention of butter. One hopes that Christians recognize which side of the daily bread provides for their spiritual benefit, on which side they can find all that is spiritually helpful, and on which side they should invest their energies. Knowing the buttered side of the bread from a spiritual perspective is about knowing what thoughts to think and what actions to take to remain or advance in a favorable spiritual situation or to avoid a bad one. The buttered side also inevitably entails knowing whom to please. Christians often conflate spiritual benefits with purely material ones, leading to choices that provide material advantages at the expense of spiritual needs and benefits. As with everything else, the buttered side of the bread boils down to motivation and its consequent choices. This does not entail that material benefits and spiritual benefits are incompatible. Material benefits and spiritual benefits can be compatible and often are. If we are honest, such benefits will appear together as butter on one side of the bread. It's when the bread appears buttered on both sides that choices need to be made. Note, everyone knows that when bread falls, it tends to land on the buttered side, an expression of pessimism par excellence. However, it could also point to the entropy inherent in this world. With this in mind, I suspect the kind of butter that hits the floor makes all the difference in the end. Including the divine feminine within Christianity. This may, at last, be possible. Bruce Charlton. I personally find the near-exclusive masculinity of traditional Christian theology, and of church organization, obviously inadequate in a spiritual sense. What comes across to me is, to a very variable but ineradicable extent, some element of cold and dead partiality of spirit, head without warmth of heart, form without motivation. The near deletion of the feminine from traditional Christianity, of all denominations, strikes me also as a distortion of reality, therefore necessarily wrong. Having recognized the problem and need, with divine help, I assume that we can do better. Yet, attempts at including the divine feminine within Christianity have been, to my judgment, unsatisfactory in one way or another. The most successful, over many centuries, has clearly been the inclusion of Mary the Mother of Jesus within both Eastern and Western Catholicism. This brings, to some extent, a balance of spirituality which is lacking from the Protestant and other churches. The Catholic conceptualization of the feminine is, again, I speak personally, inadequate, partly by its emphasis on literal virginity, and partly by its theology of intercession, which makes no sense to me, and emphasizes what I regard as a mistakenly unchristian view of God as somewhat hostile, requiring pleading and propitiation. Most other attempts to introduce the feminine, especially to church organization, have been, whether covertly or implicitly, been a part of the agenda of secularization and assimilation to totalitarian leftism of Christian churches, with predictably destructive consequences. Are we then doomed to a partial and one-sided Christianity? Well, I don't have a recipe to solve this ancient problem of the exclusion of the feminine, but the prospect is very different in a world where the basis of Christianity has moved from of the, by now deeply corrupted and increasingly malign, churches, to become rooted in personal choices and responsibility. There are at least a couple of aspects to be considered. The first and most important is theological. I have found myself first attracted and then convinced by the Mormon conceptualization of God the Creator as a heavenly parents, man and woman, celestial and eternal husband and wife. But what of Jesus? When I immersed myself in the fourth Gospel, John, with the assumption that it was the primary and most authoritative source concerning Jesus, I found that the answer had always been there, which is that Mary Magdalene was, and this, I think, pretty explicitly, described as the wife of Jesus. Furthermore, as would be expected if Jesus' wife was an important aspect of Christianity, the 5 episodes in which Mary features all occur at points of exceptional importance, turning point of the narrative. For example, see this text of the 4th Gospel for further explanation, using word search to locate the relevant passages. 1. The marriage at Cana, which I regard as the marriage of Jesus and Mary, attended by Mary's brother Lazarus, who is the author of the 4th Gospel, is the first miracle of Jesus, his assumption of divine power following his baptism by John. Mary is not named at Cana, but the other 4 episodes can be found by a Mary word search of the linked Bible text. 2. Mary then interacts with Jesus just prior to Jesus' greatest and most significant miracle, the resurrection of Lazarus, her brother. 3. The episode at Bethany of the spikenard ointment precedes and prophesies the turn towards the events of Jesus' trial and sentencing. 4. Then Mary is present at the foot of the cross to participate in Jesus' death. 5. And her last appearance is as first witness to the resurrection of Jesus. From this, I think it can be inferred, starting from the assumptions which I have made, that Mary had some kind of role, a complementary role, in the major events of Jesus' time on earth, but what exactly, I am not sure. Maybe it is not necessary to know more. But if it is necessary for me, then insight will be forthcoming so long as my motivations for seeking knowledge are good. My conclusion is that because Christianity is now a personal matter, a personal responsibility, we do not any longer need to be concerned about the institutionally destructive effects of feminism. We need to satisfy ourselves in accordance with our best intentions and deepest intuitions. If we personally feel that traditional Christianity has been, to a significant extent, an incomplete and maimed thing, then we can simply get on with the spiritual work of discovery and creation to remedy this defect. Since we are satisfying ourselves, our deepest needs and individual understanding, our need for a strong and lasting personal motivation to follow Jesus, we need not share this with anyone else. We can and will, of course, like all of the churches through history, err in our understanding, and be misled by wrong impulses and our propensity for sin. Yet, if our intent is sincere and we continue to seek truth, all such errors that have spiritually lethal consequences will be, with the direct help of the Holy Ghost, be detected, repented and corrected, and we do not need to convince other people, or an organization, before doing this vital work. The Ubik Solution. Christian messages from the neglected, discarded, despised and marginal. Bruce Charlton. Ubik, 1969, is a science fiction novel by Philip K. Dick. Without summarizing the plot, or giving away the punchline, suffice to say that it depicts an evil-permeated and rapidly entropic world, which is opposed by a God who is excluded from all mainstream and normal ways of communicating and helping. In this world, the system is all-pervasive. God's messages must come from peripheral and unexpected directions in order to get past the monitoring intelligence. Good can only work indirectly. God is to be found only in the trash of this culture. We might imagine an equivalent for our world, in which the real Christian needed to disguise itself as trash, and move out to the places into which the system does not, yet, extend. It can only find an outlet among the despised people, those regarded as absurd, insignificant, or labeled by the system as insane, idiotic, evil. The system fights back by mimicking the secret divine messages by deploying fakes as bait. The system pretends that these people and messages are radical, anti-establishment, or disapproved, yet the system contrives to draw attention to them, nonetheless. The system advertises, under pretense of warning against, exactly these baited traps, which it hopes will be mistaken for divine messages, but will lead back into the system. Meanwhile, The real messages from the divine, real goodness, are unknown or unnoticed except to those who honestly seek them, and are sensitized to their truth. The system is entropic, parasitic, destructive, and opposed to the system is Ubik. Ubik is found in various trashy forms, such as an aerosol that, albeit temporarily, opposes and reverses entropy. It heals the dissolutions of the system. Ubik is, indeed, understandable as an allegory to the Eucharist, the bread and wine of the Mass as it is supposed ideally to function, yet which is but a momentary stay against confusion, to use Robert Frost's description of poetry. Even if it was available in unlimited supply and on demand, and, in PKD's story as in our world, Ubik is actually difficult and dangerous to locate, and has a short shelf life. Ubik does not provide a permanent answer, as does not the Eucharist. But Ubik provides a chance to break free from the constancy of destruction by the entropy of the world, a chance perhaps, to clear our thoughts and make further inquiries, to seek and discover the availability of a permanent, an eternal, solution to entropy. To discover how to reach a world without entropy, without evil. Physical self-sufficiency and spiritual dependence. An impossible anti-left fantasy. Bruce Charlton. I seem to discern a pattern of belief or motivation among some of those who oppose the mainstream totalitarian establishment, which is that they desire to combining maximum physical self-sufficiency with maximum spiritual dependency on their chosen church. Unfortunately, both physical self-sufficiency and spiritual dependence are so categorically impossible in the modern West that they cannot even be approximated, therefore this fantasy is delusional. The world is the most interdependent it has ever been, there is unprecedented surveillance, and attempted physical detachment from the system is treated as criminal. Physical self-sufficiency cannot even be approximated. But spiritual dependence on external church authority is likewise impossible. All the churches are so deeply corrupted that they are incoherent, their authority is internally fractured, their instructions are labile, fluctuating, contradicting, self-undermining. This means that anyone who desires to obey his church, must in fact continually be discerning which aspect of his church he ought to obey, and which disregard or oppose. The ideal of physical self-sufficiency and spiritual dependence, is an inversion of what is unavoidable, and indeed Christianly desirable. Physical self-sufficiency is not just impossible, but irrelevant. Spiritual dependence on the authority of a church is not just impossible, but the opposite of what Christians ought to be doing. Christians cannot, no matter how much they may wish it, avoid discernment and live by obedience. Since Christians do discern and choose, this ought explicitly to be directed at God and Jesus Christ, and not at any, inevitably compromised, human institution. And, since we are, by any realistic calculation, all but powerless in socio-political terms, we ought not to be focusing our attention on changing the world, nor on positively transforming, and protecting one little corner of the world, as with the idea of self-sufficiency. We are responsible only for that over which we have genuine choice and control, our inner discernments, commitments, aspirations. In this actual world we inhabit, necessity combines with desirability to enforce a focus upon individual spiritual activity in a direct relationship with the divine. Ultimately, the physical, including socio-political, world is something with which we must cope, and not a valid object for our life's creative work. Book published. William Wildblood. My new book By No Means Equal was published in the US on November 1st. It came out last Friday in the UK. If I worked in marketing and had a flexible relationship with the truth, I could say it contains definitive proof of the soul, but I don't, and it doesn't. What it does do, though, is lay out the grounds for the spiritual primacy of individuality and freedom, and say how the reality of these fundamental principles stands in direct opposition to the contemporary ideology of equality. Which, it could be argued, amounts to almost the same thing as my imaginary marketing man is saying. For my contention is that the current obsession with equality, which sometimes presents itself as an almost spiritual belief, is in fact deeply materialistic, as it reduces the individual to a unit in the collective, a unit that can be weighed, measured and slotted into the system. A controllable and controlled unit. It robs the human being of its humanity. I suppose one of the reasons the belief in equality has taken root is because it seems to offer a degree of fairness. It also assuages the guilt of the rich and powerful, who can carry on being rich and powerful as long as they are seen to disapprove of such things in theory. It is also a more feminine way of looking at the world, and society has become increasingly feminized over the last few decades. Men are more naturally hierarchical and competitive, but women tend more to cooperation, which fits better with the equality dogma. But one could just as well say it has come about because of the desire of those at the lower end of the scale of whatever it might be to chop down those with more. This is certainly a factor, but only one of many, some rooted in the desire to be fair and some in envy. However, all of that is besides the point. The simple question to ask about equality is it true? Everything else is irrelevant. We might want it to be true for whatever reason, but if it's not true, there's an end of it. And the fact is, it's not true. Those who see themselves as superior might feel guilty about that, and those who see themselves as inferior might feel resentment, but these emotions do not alter reality. Equality is a lie. Of course, an argument might be that equality may not exist now, but we should work towards it for a fairer and better society. But what are you saying if you argue that? That society should be built on a palpable falsehood. This could never work, as reality would sooner or later break through. In the meantime, the inevitable result of your foolish experiment would be a lowering of standards, because that is what enforced equality means. The only way you can bring it about is to bring down the higher to the level of the lower. Destroy the ladder of hierarchy, and there is nothing left to climb. You remain earthbound. Examined properly, equality is just about the most anti-spiritual doctrine you could have. This is what the book is about. Fair and balanced only aids, and abets system manipulation. Francis Berger. I recently sifted through some blog posts written by others during the height of the Birdemic and the Peck campaign. The authors of some of these blogs promote themselves as rational, logical, clear-thinking individuals. As such, they tended to apply a fair and balanced approach to the Birdemic and the Peck. Needless to say, the fair and balanced posts written from 2020 to 2022 have not aged well, which immediately draws the reason, logic, and clear thinking of such authors into question. The problem with fair and balanced is not about being right or wrong. No blogger or writer I know has ever been or will ever be 100% right about everything, particularly not concerning predictions, conjectures, and speculations. The problem lies instead in the fatal belief that system communications and narratives deserve fair and balanced assessments and interpretations, and the even more tragic certitude that such fair and balanced deliberation and argumentation somehow draws both writer and reader closer to the truth. Fair and balanced thinkers and writers appear oblivious to the true nature and underlying goal of system communications and narratives, which inevitably always boil down to one thing: manipulation.
When you hear a politician speak, or read a press release or a media headline, you are not dealing with an attempt to communicate the truth about reality. You are dealing with language as calculated manipulation. Language here including visual, symbolic, audio and other media. Manipulation is language intended to shape attitudes, thought processes and actions. I can think of only two reasons why writers and thinkers would choose to apply fair and balanced perspectives to system communications. They are oblivious to the lies, propaganda,
and manipulation inherent in system communications, or they employ the fair and balanced approach to system lies to obfuscate or rationalize their own personal insincerity and manipulative calculations. Neither puts fair and balanced writers and thinkers in a favorable light. The reason, logic, and clear thinking of the former are ultimately questionable, while the motivations of the latter are immediately suspect. Fatal ignorance and dubious motivations aside, writers and thinkers who were fair and balanced about things like the Birdemic and the Peck campaign actively expanded the lies and manipulation, irrespective of intentions. How? By willingly attempting to engage in truthful discourse with known liars who are peddling zero information.
The correct inference concerning any specific communication from the system is therefore, quite simply, that system statements contain zero information. Yet we are almost all of us guilty of trying to sift truth, when the reality is that public discourse contains zero information. How do we fall into this trap? By attempting to have discourse with liars. The fact is that all discourse assumes a basic truthfulness, therefore, if we have discourse with liars, we must already have decided that they are basically truthful. And when they are not basically truthful, but instead are merely manipulating us, then we have been sucked into their world of lies. We have been trapped into interacting with zero information. Therefore, we have already been sucked into the world of manipulative lies as soon as we engage in discourse with them.
Dr. Charlton notes that virtually everyone falls into the system trap of engaging in discourse, which makes sense when you consider that system communications are ubiquitous, practically unavoidable, and broadcast 24/7 via various media. Add the masses, governments, and institutions, who all serve as amplifiers of system communication and manipulation, to the mix, and it becomes evident how difficult disengaging from discourse can be. That said, the fair and balanced crew of writers and thinkers remain among the most egregious of all discourse participants, primarily because they treat system communication as an opportunity for discourse, which is very different from recognizing the system-initiated attempts at discourse as untruthful, disingenuous, and manipulative, and simply and clearly stating as much. The rebirth of establishment-approved, pseudo-radical dissent. Bruce Charlton. The Iraqis conflict has led to the reintroduction of 1960s-style mass protest for the current generation of would-be radicals. This is something that delights the kind of self-righteous people who most value the pure altruism of public concern about the reported doings of remote and barely understood strangers. And, just as happened in the 1960s, the new generation of radicals are being offered a range of low-risk/high-visibility opportunities to advertise their pure altruism and anger on behalf of strangers. The establishment have created just enough establishment homogeneity and resistance to the radical agenda, including a modicum of oppression, such that the new radicals can imagine themselves engaged in a fight for right against wealth and power. This is perhaps the first large-scale leftist radicalism since the Occupy movement of 2011, but the Freeman cause is more effective, because it provides young Western leftists with a chance to imagine themselves in solidarity with a satisfyingly alien ethnic religious group, and whose agenda is almost completely different from, and hostile to, that of the new radicals. All of which, if it comes to awareness, increases the feeling of pure altruism. In terms of the large-scale trends of the agenda of evil, this re-emergence of youth, and boomer, radicalism is something of a step backwards for the harmonic bureaucrats, but one by which they can still imagine themselves to be in control of the situation, because of their massive influence in the mainstream pseudo-radical media, which are increasingly hardline in their pro-Freeman stance with every passing day, and their close monitoring of the situation by means of surveillance and tracking media. But, by my understanding, the reality underlying these rationalizations is that the radicals are being neutralized by negative emotions and motivations, fear, resentment, pseudo-empathic compassion, guilt, despair, even as they are encouraged to emote publicly. Meanwhile, the progression of the increasingly dominant Sorothic agenda of encouraging global and within-nation chaos proceeds under these masks. As was, indeed, the intention all along, and, presumably, the reason why the current Arrakis situation was collusively set up in the first place. Self-delusions are almost certainly suicidal. Francis Berger.
What others think may harm or kill you, depending on chance. Your own delusions, however, are almost certainly to be suicidal.
The above is another brief excerpt from Stephen Wiesense's philosophical detour The Rules of Chaos, which contains many astute insights despite being limited by firmly materialist assumptions. I refer to the passage to point out that the vast quantity of material published on blogs these days, including some of the material on this blog, deals exclusively with how the delusions of others may harm or kill us. Wiesense reminds us that this is all fine and well, but when it comes to harm, or its opposite, one hopes, our thoughts are incalculably more significant than the thoughts of others could ever be. This applies especially to delusions. It is no exaggeration to say that virtually everything the system thinks these days is intentionally designed to harm or kill us. The thinking of most people aligns seamlessly with the system, which means the thinking of most of the people around us is probably also harmful, regardless of intent. The roots of these detrimental modes of thinking extend down to errant and damaging metaphysical assumptions, the same sort of assumptions that limit Wiesense's insights in The Rules of Chaos. Most people take metaphysical assumptions for granted. This worked, to some extent, in earlier stages of human consciousness when belief in the supernatural and the divine was innate. People did not have to think too deeply about their assumptions then and were more or less free to go with the flow of their respective communities. Contemporary people can no longer indulge in this luxury, for lack of a better way of putting it, primarily because the metaphysical assumptions promulgated by those who rule our communities and societies are actively killing and spiritually destroying, leading most toward a state of abysmal despair and spiritual death. Of course, the masses, who ingest and amplify the destructive metaphysical assumptions, are not absolved of responsibility when they take such assumptions for granted in the same manner earlier people were absolved of taking personal responsibility. Unlike earlier people, contemporary man must take personal responsibility for his metaphysical assumptions. On the surface, such an obligation may seem like an external constraint or compulsion, but a deeper look reveals this assumption of assumptions to the movement of freedom. Those who regard freedom as little more than enlightenment-induced relativity poison yearn to return to days when assumptions could be taken for granted rather than assumed. At the same time, those who hold such yearnings fail to recognize that taken for granted metaphysical assumptions of earlier religious times were true but inevitably less free. Why does this matter? For the simple reason that metaphysical assumptions pointing to greater truth require greater freedom to personally assume, that is, to personally take on. Those who loathe freedom would benefit from understanding it as the assumption of personal responsibility for thinking rather than as a free license for limitless whim and desire indulgence. The belief that assuming personal responsibility for one's metaphysical assumptions is harmful, and potentially deadly is rooted in fear. Unfortunately, fear offers fertile soil for delusions. Metaphysical assumptions cannot emanate entirely from consensus or other external factors anymore. To believe such is perhaps the worst self-delusion of all. In The Rules of Chaos, Wiesense also notes that we have less control over others and more power over ourselves than we like to think. We trick ourselves into believing that we are exercising freedom when we seek to control or have power over others, but we are only truly free when we exercise control and power over ourselves.
Throughout history, men have built themselves imaginary prisons, where their deepest, longest longings for joy and adventure are barred from fulfillment by the iron gates of impossibility. The world is full of people whom no one put in chains but who bind themselves with frozen thoughts and fears.
And, more significantly, with frozen metaphysical assumptions.
A man whose mind conforms to the conditioned responses of daily life is a coward and a slave. To free himself, he must free his imagination, so that he may conceive the world as it is, a place where it is possible to be adventurous, that is, to be himself.
The matter of conceiving the world as it is represents the core of what metaphysical assumptions are all about, but this requires discovering what being ourselves really means within the context of creation, not as Wiesen says assumptions presume, within the context of random meaninglessness and chance.
A man is free when he understands that every act is like the act of love.
I'm not sure what ultimate purpose the act of love serves in Wiesen's chaotic world of chance and randomness. However, the observation is true and reminds us of what should underpin our metaphysical assumptions and our personal responsibility for them, to say nothing of the utter necessity of recognizing and challenging our own delusions. Getting beyond the expediency framework of life's pleasure and suffering entails reframing the basic questions about God's plans. Bruce Charlton. Many Christians, many people in general, approach the problem of human life in terms of a frame of its pleasures and sufferings, especially the sufferings. In other words, they primarily, as their main goal, seek to understand and explain, and find an answer for, the sufferings of the world. This approach, while it may be spontaneous for modern man, is spiritually lethal, because it is an incoherent, hence insoluble, and in practice actively harmful, way of understanding the world. I think we need to understand this world, this reality, from a starting point that assumed the reality of man's agency, free will, capacity for autonomous motivation. And a reality in which men are mixed in their nature, a mixture of good loving with evil, i.e. which opposes good. That is what God has to work with in creation, and from which heaven must be made. God's creation includes men with agency, and evil as well as good, that is the starting point. And from such ingredients it is God's self-imposed task to build heaven, a world of love. Heaven is to be made from a multitude of men, each of whom just is an agent, capable of choice and commitments. The question is, how can God make a heaven, using men with agency who each contain some evil, as well as loving motivations? Therefore, in creating heaven, God needs to work to encourage men to choose to make the eternal commitment to live wholly and permanently by love. This outcome cannot be imposed on men. We cannot understand this upfront experienced world, including that we cannot understand human suffering, unless we understand 1. What God is trying to do with us, and 2. What God had to work with. We need to understand God's aims and materials as being related, bound together, inextricably, by the nature of reality. Only thus can we grasp the meaning of the 2 great commandments, to love first God, then to love our neighbor, to understand that these laws are a terse summary of God's great task in creation, and also a brief description of how it is that God can, in principle, make heaven from a multitude of men with innate agency. Men who choose to commit eternally to love God and the neighbors, i.e. other men who have made the choice of heaven, are enabled to make this eternal commitment by that resurrection, which was offered by the work of Jesus Christ. The result, among those who have made this choice, is heaven. Evidence that God exists. Bruce Charlton. Most people in the West know that God does not exist, and they think they know this from the lack of evidence. They may ask some variant of, if God is really real, then why doesn't God communicate with us? But of course there are countless people, now and in the past, who state they know that God exists, have seen or heard or reasoned out evidence of this. What most people in the West actually mean is much more like I, personally, don't believe those people who say that God exists, and I don't believe that the evidence the believers provide is real. What is really meant is something more like I choose to believe the people and institutions that state God does not exist, and I choose to disbelieve anyone who claims God does exist, which is a very different thing from there being no evidence. That's a first-line defense. People choose who to believe, what authorities to trust. But they then pretend that they have not made this choice. They claim that their choice was not a choice, but was objective reality, to deny which is irrational self-deception. To make a choice, then to deny this was a choice, is surely the very worst kind of self-deception, because impossible of correction. It also goes deeper than that. I personally do not know of any evidence that convinces me that God exists is the kind of phrase, and what this actually means is that no such evidence of God is possible, because my understanding of reality excludes the possibility of God. My understanding of the world has no space for God. Someone who says they personally know of no evidence that God exists is therefore in truth saying something about himself, not about reality. Because his grounds for claiming there is no evidence are rooted in many chosen assumptions that might be otherwise, and these assumptions were themselves chosen. Or else the assumptions were passively accepted at first, and then later defended as being necessarily true, defended by personal choice. I know of no evidence that God exists actually means something like, I deny the possibility that there could be any evidence of God's existence, because I already have decided there is no God, and therefore any supposed evidence cannot be true. Yet such convictions, like all convictions, are ultimately chosen, and therefore we are personally, and ultimately, responsible for both our beliefs and for our disbeliefs, equally. And responsible means that we personally will take the consequences for the life we choose to lead, which life is most deeply and essentially our thought life, that of our lives over which we have the greatest choice, and in which our agency is manifested. We have little or no direct control over the material context of our lives. We don't choose the physical world we inhabit. Yet, our thinking is free, if we choose it to be free. In particular, we can choose to affirm the ultimate truth, goodness and reality of whatever we want, and to deny the reality of whatever we want. By that we make our life, and judge ourselves. Note, believing whatever you want does not mean that all alternatives are equally true, and choosing to want to believe that which you judge to be false or evil will have consequences. Tolkien's letters. William Wildblood. It seems that the collection of letters written by Tolkien to various family members, friends and Lord of the Rings enthusiasts that was published in 1981 was only the tip of his correspondence iceberg. Like many of his generation, he was a prolific letter writer, and an expanded edition which includes hundreds of previously unseen letters is due out this month. See here. I would expect the cream of the crop to have appeared already, but I don't doubt there will be treasures of wisdom in the new batch. Even in the few extracts in the linked article there are some telling insights. For example, he talks of birthdays and says that very few men, but practically all women set great store by dates and anniversaries. This after one of his sons had forgotten his mother's birthday. So true. Then, very pertinently for the present time, he writes in 1956 about the reaction in the country to the Suez crisis. He says, I am really alarmed at the hysteria in this country. It may well be a prelude to mob rule. Half Oxford is in a kind of screaming frenzy and then talks of armed pacifism, destroying the vehicles of innocent citizens and dons yelling fascist, at high table, at colleagues who in mild voices venture to disagree with them. It seems the academic world was already well on the way to its present state of spiritual corruption. He sums it all up by writing the profound truth that what a rot and stink is left by liberalism devoid of religion. This is our modern world in a nutshell, though, of course, we are much more advanced than was the case in Tolkien's day. Further on in this same letter he comments that all leftists are anti-philology, which is an interesting observation. In 1961 he writes that Oxford continues to suffer from the ravages of the machine worshippers. I remember it as a little old university town nestling in the country, and it had about 55,000 inhabitants. It now has nearly 100,000 more, sprawls in every direction, and is jammed with noise and smell, and every now and again the most hideous buildings go up. He does praise the removal of slum dwellings on the edge of town, but there is no doubt that in his mind the cons are worse than the pros. Later on he tells us that Orcai derived from Anglo-Saxon, a word meaning a demon, usually supposed to be derived from the Latin orcus, hell. But I doubt this, though the matter is too involved to set out here. Warg is simple. It is an old word for wolf, which also had the sense of an outlaw or hunted criminal. I have always thought these words and many others in Tolkien's creation actually speak of what they are. His genius extended into many fields, but perhaps manifested most strongly in that of language, which is not surprising since language was his business. Anyway, every word and every name too in Tolkien just seems right. No other author comes close to him in this respect. No, delusions do not breed cowardice. Francis Berger.
Delusions breed cowardice. We cannot believe falsehoods in quite the same way as truths. Unless one is clinically insane, one cannot lie to oneself with absolute conviction. Reality asserts a residue of doubt, and so one is afraid to put one's daydreams to the test.
Thus writes Stephen Vincent in The Rules of Chaos, published in 1969. I beg to differ. The decades since Vincent penned the passage above have proven that delusions do not breed cowardice. On the contrary, they breed hubris, pride, vanity, conceit, and pomposity. Delusions also attract money, truckloads of it, and fame, popularity, prestige, rank, and power. Delusions are not only rewarded but held in high regard. They are admired, studied, respected, esteemed, and exalted. Delusions also offer safety, security, solidness, and soundness. Our modern milieu has revealed that people are extremely adept at believing falsehoods and virtually incapable of seeing truth, even obvious, mundane ones. They seem perfectly adept at lying to themselves with absolute conviction. Most lie to themselves with absolute conviction several hundred times daily, leaving no space for doubt residues. Modern people are more than happy to put their daydreams to the test, at least the daydreams the system promotes. Does this mean that modern people are clinically insane? If by clinically insane we mean mental illness of such a severe nature that a person cannot distinguish fantasy from reality, cannot conduct her/his affairs due to psychosis, or is subject to uncontrollable impulsive behavior, then yeah, I guess most modern people are clinically insane. So what now, Mr. Vincent? Wait for reality to reassert itself through chance, randomness, and chaos. The Question of Evidence of Life After Death, from Philip K. Dick. Bruce Charlton. I feel as if I am channeling W.M. Jastajkanevich in reporting this following, sort of, synchronicity, which is that immediately after writing my post on the question of evidence of God, I continued my rereading of The Transmigration of Timothy Archer by Philip K. Dick, 1982, in which I came across the following, edited, and with my additional emphasis.
Is there any proof of God's existence? Bill said. After a pause, Tim said, a number of arguments are given. Perhaps the best is the argument from biology, advanced for instance by Teilhard de Chardin. Evolution, the existence of evolution, seems to point to a designer. Also there is Morrison's argument that our planet shows a remarkable hospitality toward complex forms of life. The chance of this happening on a random basis is very small. There are proofs, Tim said. But God doesn't talk to anybody, Bill said. No, Tim said. He rallied, then, I saw him draw himself up. However, the Old Testament gives us many instances of Yahweh addressing his people through the prophets. This fountain of revelation dried up, finally. God no longer speaks to man. It is called the long silence. It has lasted 2,000 years. I realize God talked to people in the Bible, Bill said, in the olden days, but why doesn't he talk to them now? Why did he stop? I don't know, Tim said. He said no more, there he ceased. I really wish you would explain it to me, Bill said to Tim. Because it's impossible. It's not just unlikely, it's impossible. Jeff, i.e. Tim's deceased son, has communicated with the two of us, Tim said. Through intermediary phenomena. Many times, in many ways, it is God himself working on us and through us to bring forth a brighter day. My son is with us now, he is with us in this room. He never left us. What died was a material body. Every material thing perishes. Whole planets perish. The physical universe itself will perish. Are you going to argue, then, that nothing exists? Because that is where your logic will carry you. It isn't possible right now to prove that external reality exists. Descartes discovered that. It's the basis of modern philosophy. All you can know for sure is that your own mind, your own consciousness, exists. You can say, I am and that's all. What you see is not world but a representation formed in and by your own mind. Everything that you experience you know by faith. Also, you may be dreaming. Had you thought of that? Plato relates that a wise old man, probably an Orphic, said to him, now we are dead and in a kind of prison. Plato did not consider that an absurd statement. He tells us that it is weighty and something to think about. Now we are dead. We may have no world at all. I have enough evidence, your mother and I, for Jeff returning to us as I have that the world itself exists. We do not suppose he has come back, we experience him as coming back. We have lived and are living through it. So it is not our opinion. It is real. Real for you, Bill said. What more can reality give? Well, I mean, Bill said, I don't believe it. The problem does not lie with our experience in this matter, Tim said. It lies with your belief system. Within the confines of your belief system, such a thing is impossible. Who can say, truly say, what is possible? We have no knowledge of what is and isn't possible. We do not set the limits, God sets the limits. What do you believe, then? In objects you get into and drive around the block. There may be no objects and no block. Someone pointed out to Descartes that a malicious demon may cause our ascent to a world that is not there, may impress a forgery onto us as an ostensible representation of the world. If that happened, we would not know. We must trust God. I trust in God that he would not deceive me. I deem the Lord faithful and true and incapable of deceit. For you that question does not even exist, for you will not grant that he exists in the first place. You ask for proof. If I told you this minute that I have heard God's voice speaking to me, would you believe that? Of course not. We call people who speak to God pious and we call people to whom God speaks lunatics. This is an age where there is little faith. It is not God who is dead, it is our faith that has died. But, Bill gestured. It doesn't make any sense. Why would he come back, from the dead? Tell me why Jeff lived in the first place, Tim said. Then perhaps I can tell you why he came back. Why do you live? For what purpose were you created? You do not know who created you, assuming anyone did, and you do not know why, assuming there is a why. Perhaps no one created you and perhaps there is no purpose to your life. No world, no purpose, no creator, and Jeff has not come back to us. Is that your logic? Is that how you live out your life? Is that what being, in Heidegger's sense, is to you? That is an impoverished kind of inauthentic being. It strikes me as weak and barren and, in the end, futile.
It strikes me that these are strong, valid arguments, despite that Timothy Archer, is depicted as the worst kind of trendy leftist, self-justifying hedonic Episcopalian bishop from the 1960s. And despite that Tim's belief in the return of his deceased son is depicted by the agnostic narrator, his daughter-in-law, widow of the deceased son, as merely a wish-fulfilling yet dangerous delusion. The modern mainstream idea of evidence has always, as seen above, been ultimately incoherent in its own rationalistic terms, even when its professional practice was honestly applied and coherent in terms on a basis in circular assumptions and reasoning. Yet nowadays, and since the 1990s, the public and in practice conceptualization of evidence, of facts, of reality, has been thoroughly corrupted into, literally, nothing more than the current, official, establishment consensus, as currently propagated by the official mass media. Evidence in practice therefore means nothing more than a very vague, diffuse, and open-endedly changeable impression of what seems acceptable to those with power, wealth and high status. The more that people, or institutions, or algorithms, talk about and assert evidence/facts/realism and their importance, the more manipulative, dishonest and intentionally evil is the actuality. Earlier standards of evidence, which existed, at least in England, within several discourses such as science, academia and law, have by now been annihilated, as coherence of reasoning and statement have themselves been annihilated. Therefore arguments such as those of Bishop Timothy Archer in the above passage, have altogether lost traction. There can be no basis for argument, or evidence, when there is no commitment to truth, and no interest in knowing reality. Spiritual life, make it contact, make it personal. Bruce Charlton. I have a strong, and still increasing, conviction that we ought to move away from the kind of impersonal abstraction that has been characteristic of spiritual, mystical, meditative and prayer life for many centuries, so much so that the two are often regarded as synonymous. Christian mystics have, for instance, often been Neoplatonic in their rationale and experience, and mysticism is often asserted to be a negative state of indescribable, inexpressible experience. What I mean is that the ultimate is often supposed to be an experience and a subject that is beyond the personal. On the other hand, personal experience of the spiritual, that is, when there is some kind of contact with a Christian personage, whether Jesus Christ, Blessed Virgin Mary, a saint of angel, or any other individual of higher spiritual stature, have also often been reported. But typically such an interaction has been conversational. An experience of meeting together perhaps, and conversing. Such experiences as talking with a statue or crucifix, an icon, or at a shrine, speaking oneself and hearing replies in the mind. Maybe meeting with another person in a dream-like state, or an actual dream, accompanied by vivid visions. Perhaps writing questions and then being dictated answers, or automatic writing. These two seem like the options, either, on the one hand, a sophisticated and intellectual kind of abstraction and negation, or else, on the other hand, a rather childlike interaction with a personage that operates rather like a mundane conversation. This tends to encourage adult, and educated, Christians to abandon the personal, and embrace the abstract. But there is at least one other option, which is something I have at times experienced. An example is when I was immersively reading and thinking about the fourth gospel, but an earlier instance relates to more recent historical people who I came to regard as spiritual teachers, William Arkell and JRR Tolkien. I have elsewhere talked about the fourth gospel and Arkell experiences, but not really about Tolkien. My Tolkien experiences were related mainly to my original readings and re-readings of the Notion Club papers, including the notes by Tolkien's son Christopher. The fragmentary, incomplete, nature of the NCPs, and the fact that they required, or, at least, invited, speculative completion, was what made me embark upon the attempt to experience the work from Tolkien's perspective, by a kind of sympathetic identification with Tolkien. The result was that, from my personal perspective, I felt a clear and sure kind of understanding of what Tolkien meant or intended by particular passages, due to a subjective experience of validation or endorsement by, what felt like, Tolkien's spirit. To be more specific, I struggled with particular sections of the texts relating to the NCPs, and at times felt I knew just what they were getting at, what experiences of Tolkien's they were derived from, what aspirations of Tolkien's they related to. This was personal, like a kind of communion or co-thinking with Tolkien's spirit, but they were never conversational in form, nor in the form of questions and answers, nor was it anything like telepathy or reading thoughts. And they were mostly not mediated by words or pictures or anything else. The experience was much more like what I have termed direct knowing. That is a personal experience of what I assumed were Tolkien's primary thoughts in relation to the subject. Although sometimes I did experience his mental pictures as well, such as pictures of what was being described, for example a burning meteor in the Earth's atmosphere. These pictures were more like secondary illustrations of the direct experiences which were primary. In other words, it was more like being a burning meteor than a picture of one. Of course, there is no particular reason why anyone else should assume that I have got these things right. I might well be regarded as fooling myself with wishful thinking, or trying to impress other people by claiming special authority by, whether manipulatively or delusionally, having a direct line to the author. Furthermore, in communicating such matters, what another person gets is itself a result of reading my writings or, in principle, hearing me speak on the subject. Such is always something of a secondary nature compared with the original subjective experience, being only an expression of what I experienced, and also requiring the reader to interpret and understand the writings. The thing is that I don't really care what other people think about it. For me, the experiences were well motivated and self-validating, and had spiritual value. That is the reason for them, and the reason for writing about them. They are part of my spiritual life, not, except accidentally and occasionally, a matter of interacting publicly, except for a general hope that I may encourage more people to read and meditate upon the Notion Club papers. I do not take a single such experience as everlastingly decisive, so, I have checked the initial experiences many times over the years for coherence and stability of understanding, mainly by reusing the experiences in other thinking, at later times. The special value of these first experiences in relation to the Notion Club papers is that this sense of attuning to the spirit of Tolkien, his intentions, worked as a key to the NCP writings, to my being able to appreciate and learn from some texts that initially made very little impression on me, which indeed, at first glance, I found rather dull and frustrating. My point here is to suggest that such an engagement may be of value to other people, at least when motivations are good, and when the person whose spirit is sought is one with whom there is a strong respect, liking, indeed love, and when there is a valid desire to understand, and to learn from him. In retrospect, I think that the incomplete nature, and relatively small amount of material, in the published Notion Club papers, was actually very helpful. It is too easy and false to try and understand a person by means of reading a great deal by him, and about him. For example, many historical persons have attracted a vast literature, and the reader is tempted to discover them at second hand, by learning and compiling great swathes of evidence from reading their entire outputs, from autobiography, biographies, memoirs, letters, critical scholarship, etc. I do this myself, and have done so with Tolkien. Yet, I don't think I ever achieved such a sense of knowing Tolkien the man, as I did from my engagement with the bits and pieces that constitute the Notion Club papers. Indeed, extra material can sometimes, apparently, interfere with and hinder the understanding of a person, a spirit, by layering over, burying, confusing an already achieved empathic understanding. I found this with William Arkell. When I had very little biographical information about Arkell, I was compelled to wring everything possible out of that little I did know. I would brood on it, and press my mental understanding towards grasping his meanings by a kind of identification. When later I found out more supposedly objective information, it overwrote the earlier understanding to an extent. The new material made a screen between myself and the author, rather as a movie can overwrite the experience of a book with its explicit imagery and specific interpretations. My experience of Tolkien, in the early 1970s, was similar, there were only a handful of books by or about Tolkien, and I could not access all of these, therefore what I had was scarce, precious, and pored over repeatedly. Some was copied out. I even tried to make my own illustrations. I think this behavior relates to the achievements of medieval scholarship in the pre-printing manuscript era, when books were scarce, precious, and therefore closely pondered over long periods. In such circumstances, reading sometimes itself became a form of contemplative prayer. But there is more to this phenomenon of communing with an author than merely sustained and loving attention. We also need to be believed that it is possible for us genuinely to establish actual contact with the spirit of someone who is dead. Before I acknowledged the reality of a spiritual world, beyond and encompassing the material reality, I had a less powerful and less real experience of such identification. Consequently, I was much more concerned that my understanding was endorsed by other people. Examples would include a deep identification with Shakespeare via Hamlet in my late teens, or a similar attitude to Ralph Waldo Emerson in my 30s. Although very strong in a subjective way, these feelings nonetheless seemed to need decoding into implications for modern life, and for my particular life. I was focused on learning lessons from authors, mostly because, at heart, I regarded such experiences as symbolic, and not really real. But now, because I know that life beyond mortal death is possible, and because I believe that there may be communication between the living and the so-called dead, new depth and strength becomes possible and recognized. It is probably worth emphasizing that I am not here talking about channeling JRR Tolkien. This is not a matter of Tolkien speaking through me. With the kind of spiritual contact I described above for the Notion Club papers, I was not a passive recipient of information, instead I had to do all the work. Note, this, of course, also means that I am personally responsible for what I have written on the subject. The understanding reached was my understanding, not JRRT's intention, but my experience was of my understanding being endorsed by Tolkien. The result is not experienced as Tolkien's exact personal intention, nor even Tolkien's words. Instead, it is more like me suggesting to Tolkien a particular explanation or interpretation, and the direct endorsement being of a nature somewhat like, but never in words, yes. Okay. That's near enough. It's pretty close to what I intended. After all, even among our closest family and friends, we do not experience perfect understanding of ourselves, nor can we achieve perfect understanding of our loved ones, nor are communications of understanding any better than approximate in expression and interpretation. Yet such situations are very far from hopeless, and we do experience moments and periods of certainty, or spiritual harmony and accord. My understanding is that it is possible, with correct understanding, right motivations, and sufficient personal effort, to experience the same sort of spiritual contact with dead authors, artists, philosophers etc., that we can with our living beloved family and friends. Note added 10th of November 2023. It strikes me that it is worthwhile to analyze the general, public significance of my, or anyone else's, claim of experiencing spiritual contact with an author, whether dead, or indeed still alive. In terms of such public activities as literary scholarship or criticism, because false claims are so easy, and none can be checked externally, a person's claim of special spiritual understanding cannot be allowed to have any formal or explicit significance. Scholarship or criticism ought to stand or fall on its intrinsic qualities. This is what ought to happen in an ideal sense, despite that, in practice, this is seldom the case, and that instead high-status institutional affiliations and educational certifications of the scholar or critic are too often taken as validation of specific claims. So, we ought to judge for ourselves and not accept spiritual claims of another person simply because they have been made. Nonetheless, it seems absolutely valid to take into account such matters as spiritual affinity, when evaluating Tolkien scholarship and criticism. And, in practice, this is done, both by the majority mainstream, secular and academic, Tolkien scholars, and also by the significant minority of scholars whose perspective on Tolkien is rooted in his devoutly Roman Catholic religion. For myself, I make an evaluation concerning each scholar's spiritual sympathy, that is his empathic understanding of Tolkien, and my attitude is, broadly, that the scope of a scholar's understanding is constrained by the limits of his spiritual sympathy. That does not exclude the possibility that, within that scope, a scholar may make a vast contribution to the understanding of Tolkien. Thus, IMO, the greatest of Tolkien scholars so far, Tom Shippey, is neither a Catholic nor a Christian. Nonetheless, that constraint is still operative, and I would not expect Shippey to have much to contribute to a spiritual approach to Tolkien, that is, to the idea of regarding JRR Tolkien as a spiritual mentor and guide, as I do. Broadening out the argument, my summary is that each of us whose concern is spiritual and Christian, can and should be discerning and evaluating, and taking into consideration, the degree and nature of spiritual affiliation between a specific scholar, critic or philosopher, and any person under discussion. In sum, making decisions concerning spiritual affiliation is not just relevant, but a necessary activity in the world generally, as well as literature specifically. Of all the golden calves in the world, none is more golden than altruism. Francis Berger. I was perusing a site called Global Research this morning, when I stumbled upon an article called Financial Dictatorship Changes Human Consciousness by Joris Valukinas. I was tempted to keep scrolling at first because the premise struck me as too obvious, but the mention of human consciousness piqued my interest, so I waded in. The following summarizes the writer's ideas: human consciousness took a wrong turn somewhere and has been hijacked by the same market mechanisms the establishment employs to enslave and destroy people. This market form of consciousness has turned the masses into selfish predators who view the world and everything in it as food to satiate vulgar, self-centered appetites. Human consciousness shapes reality creatively, but in its current form, it has been harnessed for destruction. Human consciousness should be developing to the realization that the world's people must unite, that we are all in this together, and that we are also unified with the natural world. It is necessary to completely abandon the instinctive path of development, taking the path of intelligent construction of one's future. Free the economy from mandatory growth and maximum profit. Bank interest should be prohibited, and the entire financial sector should become a single organism of the state. The most important issue is the rejection of false material values and a return to the true ones, which are land and water. People should again feel one with the nature around them. As for spiritual values, their return will be inevitable in conditions of unity. We are all a society of a common destiny. I cannot say how to implement all this in practice, but it will have to be done. Otherwise, the wheel of history will do it, but with more tragic consequences. If you are somewhat confused by the seemingly conflicting metaphysical assumptions, you are not alone. Valukinas strikes me as the sort of person who has made some real breakthroughs in discernment, but his metaphysical assumptions are plagued by an abundance of what Owen Barfield referred to as residual unresolved positivism, as his conclusion amply demonstrates.
Man and the nature surrounding him are a single whole. Our ancestors knew this very well, living with it in complete harmony. The fact that everything in our world is interconnected is confirmed by quantum science. It is not at all necessary to be a scientist to see the obvious. Just look at a map of the planet, which, plus or minus, is 70% covered with water. The rest 30% is earth. The human body consists of 70% water and 30% earth elements. Perhaps this is a coincidence, many will think, but for some reason, I don't think so. Any living biological matter by its nature is a continuation of the earth, and the earth is a continuation of the sky. The physical body of each of us will in due time become part of the earth. The water, having changed its properties, will rise into the sky, purify itself, and again pour onto the earth with rain, filling the surrounding nature with life. This is the same eternal process of sowing and reaping that Christ spoke about in his time. How can we break out of this closed cycle of our physical nature and realize the meaning of our life in this world?
Well, I humbly suggest prioritizing life that is not in this world, but Valukinas is not ready to make that leap yet. He's entirely focused on meaning in this world.
The Soviet period, despite its many mistakes, gave us an important lesson that we need to deeply comprehend and draw conclusions for ourselves. For me personally, this period opened my eyes to all the strengths and weaknesses of human nature. It looked like the beginning of awakening from a dream, just before the dawn began. As for the power of money and humanity's dependence on it, the head of the Rothschild clan answered this question very directly. People just need to stop worshipping the golden calf, and this dependence will disappear.
True as that may be, what people like Valukinas fail to notice is that are essentially replacing the worshipping of one golden calf with another. In the specific case of Valukinas, this new golden calf is the vision of a unified global society in complete harmony with nature, a sort of green Marxism, if you will. Nowhere is this golden calf more clearly displayed than in Valukinas' lament concerning the absence of altruism in the modern world.
At the heart of market thinking, a reflex has been developed that encourages the consumer to consider the whole world, including the people around him, as potential food for himself. In this thinking, the concept of altruism is completely absent, which does not correspond to the nature of the world around us and man himself. This fact is directly related to the fall in the birth rate, the loss of a sense of unity, and much more.
First, the concept of altruism does not in any way correspond to the nature of the world around us and to man himself, because the concept of altruism is the brainchild of Auguste Comte, the father of positivism, who vehemently denied the reality of religion and the spiritual. Second, altruism cannot correspond to the nature of the world and to man himself precisely because it is and has always been a deeply anti-religious and anti-spiritual principle that has nothing at all to do with Christ or Christianity. Last, Jesus did not promote altruism. At its core, Valukinas' ultimate vision concerning the development of human consciousness is the establishment of Comte's social positivism, with society sitting atop the hierarchy of values, or as Comte called it, the hierarchy of sciences. Within this vision rests Comte's dictum: the only real life is the collective life of the race, individual life has no existence except as an abstraction. Valukinas' metaphysical assumptions include some fairly juicy self-delusions. However, my primary aim in this post is to draw attention to the larger issue of putting first things first. If your discernment leads you to believe that society and culture are atop the hierarchy of values or science or whatever, or that an individual should dedicate his life energies solely to the furtherment or preservation of society and culture, then your discernment remains entangled in the sticky pit of altruism, and its inevitable social positivism. The same applies to those who liberally throw around the demography is destiny line, also one of Comte's ideas, by the way. If you think that's no big deal, remember that Comte was the man who claimed that religion is an illusion of childhood, outgrown under proper education. Taking into account the nature and scope of another person's spiritual affiliation, and degree of sympathetic identification. Bruce Charlton. Further to yesterday's blog post. It strikes me that it is worthwhile to analyze the general, public significance of my, or anyone else's, claim of experiencing spiritual contact with an author, whether dead, or indeed still alive. In terms of such public activities as literary scholarship or criticism, because false claims are so easy, and none can be checked externally, a person's claim of special spiritual understanding cannot be allowed to have any formal or explicit significance. Scholarship or criticism ought to stand or fall on its intrinsic qualities. This is what ought to happen in an ideal sense, despite that, in practice, this is seldom the case, and that instead high-status institutional affiliations and educational certifications of the scholar or critic are too often taken as validation of specific claims. So, we ought to judge for ourselves and not accept spiritual claims of another person simply because they have been made. Nonetheless, it seems absolutely valid to take into account such matters as spiritual affinity, when, as a merely specific example, evaluating Tolkien scholarship and criticism. And, in practice, this is done, both by the majority mainstream, secular and academic, Tolkien scholars, and also by the significant minority of scholars whose perspective on Tolkien is rooted in his devoutly Roman Catholic religion. For myself, I make an evaluation concerning each scholar's spiritual sympathy, that is his empathic understanding of Tolkien, and my attitude is, broadly, that the scope of a scholar's understanding is constrained by the limits of his spiritual sympathy. That does not exclude the possibility that, within that scope, a scholar may make a vast contribution to the understanding of Tolkien. Thus, IMO, the greatest of Tolkien scholars so far, Tom Shippey, is neither a Catholic nor a Christian. Nonetheless, that constraint is still operative, and I would not expect Shippey to have much to contribute to a spiritual approach to Tolkien, that is, to the idea of regarding JRR Tolkien as a spiritual mentor and guide, as I do. Broadening out the argument, my summary is that each of us whose concern is spiritual and Christian, can and should be discerning and evaluating, and taking into consideration, the degree and nature of spiritual affiliation between a specific scholar, critic or philosopher, and any person under discussion. In sum, making decisions concerning another person's spiritual affiliation is not just relevant, but a necessary activity in the world generally, as well as literature specifically. The ideal of a unified, altruistic society. Francis Berger. Ask modern people to describe the indispensable components of an ideal society or civilization. I guarantee you that most would check off unity and altruism as essential characteristics, regardless of what part of the political spectrum they identify with. The self-identified leftist liberal types would employ words like diversity and inclusivity to describe their idea of unity and terms like social justice and equality/equity to outline their vision of people living for the sake of others. Those on the right would portray unity as culture, class, nation, or race, and altruism as the duty to self-sacrifice to conserve and preserve cultural, class-based, national, or racial unity. It doesn't take more than a cursory glance to understand that both conceptualizations and the countless others along the political spectrum are variations of the same theme. Both fail to properly or fully address the spiritual foundation underpinning the material reality of societies and civilizations. From 2020 to 2022, the world got a little taste of what a so-called ideal society or civilization founded on unity and altruism would look like and be like. The dreaded birdemic plague provided the world unity and altruism, the two components nearly all modern people yearn for. The severe measures implemented in the name of keeping everyone safe from everyone else integrated everyone into an unprecedented display of unity, while the PEC campaign granted people the opportunity to do something selfless for the benefit of others and the world. Freedom, agency, and rights were trampled and cast aside to answer the call for unity and altruism. People who envision ideal societies and civilizations, through the prism of unity and altruism, unavoidably favor establishing societal or civilizational despotism over the individual. Put another way, people who allow political/social spectrums to dominate their thinking inescapably aspire to some form of totalitarianism, because their thinking is ineluctably mired in positivism, which considers theism and metaphysics null and void. A conceptualization of reality that renounces theism and metaphysics has no use for individuals, motivation, choice, agency, rights, or freedom. The individual exists only to serve the collective, and the focal point of the collective is society, something Auguste Comte makes explicitly clear in his The Catechism of Positivist Religion. I know, the irony, right? Reject all religion and then write a catechism. Anyway.
Social positivism only accepts duties, for all and towards all. Its constant social viewpoint cannot include any notion of rights, for such a notion always rests on individuality. We are born under a load of obligations of every kind, to our predecessors, to our successors, and to our contemporaries. These obligations then increase or accumulate, for it is some time before we can return any service. Any human right is therefore as absurd as immoral. Since there are no divine rights anymore, this concept must therefore disappear completely as related only to the preliminary regime and totally inconsistent with the final state where there are only duties based on functions.
Comte's last point about the much vaunted final state, where only duties based on functions exist, is disturbing and revealing. We certainly got a sample of what that might look like during the Birdemic, didn't we? Comte is also famous for uttering the following.
But now, I, Auguste Comte, have discovered the truth. Therefore, there is no longer any need for freedom of thought or freedom of the press. I want to rule and to organize the whole country.
In the end, all positivism comes down to the desire to rule. Mandate unity and altruism for all and use that as the foundation of truth through which one accesses power. Once power has been secured, banish all freedom of thought, and focus entirely on ruling the unified, selfless masses in the name of truth. Thankfully, theism and metaphysics are not null and void. God exists. Creation exists. You and I exist, which means we still have freedom, agency, and choice, but we must want and exercise these to enjoy them. The system can turn on a dime when instructed to do so. Francis Berger. The following is an excerpt from a Substack written by a German blogger who goes by the pseudonym Eugipius.
Some valued readers objected to my remark in yesterday's post that the political establishment appear completely powerless to stop migration. They point out that the importation of foreign political clients furthers elite interests and suggest that the present wave of mass migration is desired, perhaps even deliberately engineered. Now that my internet is functioning again, I will risk repeating some old Plague Chronicle themes, in order to explain my thinking more fully. First of all, I agree that our rulers have eagerly sponsored mass migration for a long time. They also collaborated in constructing the massive tapestry of NGOs, philanthropic organizations and human smuggling bands that continue funneling the Third World into Europe today. In theory, the political establishment could stop this nonsense tomorrow by any number of measures. Italy could stop fishing migrants out of the ocean, Germany could stop paying them money, and EU member states could bin the egregiously dumb legal construct of asylum. Alas, the managerial state simply can't turn on a dime like this. All policies are subject to powerful inertial forces, because of the sheer complexity of the institutional apparatus and the vast numbers of people involved. It takes years for the system to even recognize that what it is doing is stupid, and still longer for it to stop acting stupidly. The present influx, which reflects forces set in motion more than a decade ago, is a catastrophe of the regime's own making, and one it is very ill-equipped to address.
I'm not sure if Eugipius is religious or not. His choice of pseudonym seems to imply that he is, but it could be that he just thinks the name sounds cool because it is difficult to pronounce. Whatever the case, I do read his blog every now and then and have found some of his material enlightening. All the same, I'd like to say a few words concerning the bold, added sentence above. Eugipius's premise here is that the system, as a lumbering, complex bureaucratic behemoth involving vast numbers of people and mechanisms, cannot turn on a dime, hence, its unavoidable propensity to implement its policies and decisions in a plodding and slow-moving manner. This is only partially true. Yes, most of the system's machinations are plodding and protracted, but this does not entail that the system is incapable of turning on a dime whenever it is instructed to do so. Case in point, the Birdemic and its subsequent Peck campaign, during which the system proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it was impressively capable of turning on a dime. The system did not let the sheer complexity of the institutional apparatus obstruct anything there. The vast amounts of people involved proved to be an asset, not a liability. Inertia and passivity gave way to energy and activity. Put simply, The system proved extremely competent in getting everyone and everything to get with the program with breathtaking quickness and efficiency. Eusebius calls his blog a plague chronicle and has dedicated much effort and energy to covering the birdemic, yet he seems to have trouble remembering just how quick and efficient the sheer complexity of the institutional apparatus can be. It all comes down to the system's goals and motivations. Some things are purposefully slow and drawn out and others hit like lightning. Now, Eusebius may have a bad memory, but I suspect his take on how the system operates has more to do with appearing fair and balanced. The Abolition of Man. William Wildblood. I was flipping through The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis recently, a book I last read quite a long time ago and the contents of which I had forgotten. It's a short work, based on lectures he gave in 1943, and is not overtly religious in theme even though it is in essence. What it does is defend universal spiritual values against the contemporary assault on them, specifically in the field of education, which denied that moral and aesthetic values were grounded in something objective. It was the beginning of the moral relativism, now so firmly established, which dismisses the idea that there are universal truths and these are rooted in an absolute reality. Lewis argues for something he calls in this book the Tao, the word deriving, of course, from ancient Chinese philosophy, which is something like Maut in ancient Egypt or just objective reality, the foundation truth of the universe and of being in general. The Tao is not provable by materialistic, rational, intellectual, logical, scientific means because it derives from a ground much deeper than can be accessed by these on their own. It is recognized, known, accepted, seen, or not by the spiritually blind, but it is not verifiable by empirical evidence as that phrase is normally understood. It should be self-evident but cannot be proved by any of the ways materialists demand proof. At the end of these lectures Lewis provides a compendium of sayings illustrative of natural law drawn from many different sources and traditions ranging from Egyptian, Roman, Greek and Chinese to Christian, Hindu and Jewish to Norse, Anglo-Saxon, Babylonian, American Indian, and Australian Aborigine. But there is nothing from the second main monotheistic religion. This might seem a strange oversight, if oversight it is, but it reminded me of the time I first became interested in spiritual matters and studied scriptures from all the main traditions. I already knew the Bible reasonably well but reread the New Testament in the light of my newfound interests and beliefs. I read Hindu and Buddhist scriptures, the classics of Taoism and Zen and also some collections of wise words, similar to Lewis's compendium. All these spoke of mystical understanding, perhaps in different ways and on different levels and some more than others, but they all had an insight into higher reality. Then I read the holy book of the second main monotheistic religion expecting to find more of the same. What a disappointment. There was nothing in this frankly hodgepodge collection of writings that approached the profundity of other scriptures. It barely reached the level of Old Testament spiritual understanding, never mind the New Testament. It was clear that the compiler of this text, which seemed like a New Age channeling, albeit in the context of its time and place, was nowhere near the spiritual level of the founders of other religions. Now, maybe these teachings were a step forward for the people of that time and place, but they have little to say to us today, unlike other scriptures which can transcend time and place and still speak to us across the centuries. It is often said that the three monotheistic religions worship the same God, but they approach him in such different ways that is hard to maintain in any seriousness. For the Christian, God is a loving father, but the God depicted in this holy book demands total allegiance as a despot does from a slave. He may be a benign despot if you obey him, but he leaves no room for you as a free individual. I'm not disputing there are many pious worshippers of God in this religion, but there are also encouragements to violence, and though these are often glossed over and excused by believers, they are plainly there in the source texts, which are the holy book and the recorded sayings of its founder, who was a war leader as much as he was a prophet. The extremism in this religion is fundamental to it. The West used to know that, and from hard-won experience. Despite what you might be thinking, I am not writing this in the context of the present conflict in the Middle East. It's not the Middle East I am concerned about but the West. The second main monotheistic religion is not willing to share power. It will accommodate itself to its perceived rivals in the short term only for long-term advantage. That has been demonstrated historically repeatedly. If the modernist ethos of relativism, as described by C.S. Lewis, is one way of abolishing man, so too is an absolutist religion which gives all power to the deity and leaves no freedom for the individual human soul. It must obey. It must submit. It's in the name? But God does not want obedience. He wants love. Why do you call them citadels of darkness? Francis Berger.
Why do you call Oxford and Columbia citadels of darkness? Isn't it obvious? Never in the history of the world has the planet been flooded with many so-called educated and enlightened individuals clutching their precious little degrees. Yet what has this expansion of education and enlightenment brought us? Verge paused for a moment and waited for an answer to his question. When none was forthcoming, he continued, "Why, a perishing society, of course." He swirled his cognac again. A bemused expression spread across his face. The absolute triumph of mediocrity under the flag of humanism. They have drowned us all in an infinite sea of vulgarity during their relentless assault against Western civilization with their atheism, their reductionism, their positivism, their materialism. That, my dear friends, is the lasting testament of the citadels of darkness. Bless them in their effort to enlighten us.
Note, I wrote that fictionalized assessment of higher education institutions over a decade ago. Since then the citadels have only grown darker. Makes one wonder where universities will be in a decade's time. Suffice to say, the prognosis looks grim.